You're listening to Cinema Rex. It's an Iranian film podcast. That's right. You've stumbled into the right spot to listen to stuff about Iranian films. Episode 32, Sierra, Urich's Joonam. Farhan, are you nervous right now?
No. Okay. I've just spoken like 20 words so far today.
I know, but you're stumbling your words. I see the hearts in your eyes.
Don't start this.
If I went to you and said, here's the words I can think of for endearment, and I say Joonam, Azizam, Jigaram, what else can you add on top of that?
Kuchulu.
What else? Farhan, you usually have like a wealth of...
Use the ones that I use. I don't know, you could make stuff up. Like you could call someone like Mushmushak if you wanted. I don't know.
Musham.
Okay.
Musham.
I call my daughter Juja all the time.
Oh, Juja is good.
Juje.
Did you say Jigar?
I said Jigar, yeah. Durud bar shama dustan aziz. It's the Cinema Rex podcast, where we talk all things Iranian films, music, television, directing, writing,
Terms of
endearment, there you go, documentaries. I'm Kaveh Mohabi,
and I'm Farhan Moradi.
And Farhan, how's your? Yeah, okay, good. So today we have a guest.
What was that?
I'm just excited to get to our guest.
Fair.
How have you been, Farhan?
Good.
Last night, you and I and our guest went to a screening of Seed of the Sacred Fig. What are your thoughts on
Well, unfortunately, I was bamboozled by the Santa Claus parade that cut the city in half, and I couldn't get to the other side of Bloor. And by the time I got to the screening, it was like 40 minutes into it. And our guest had the same experience, and she lives much closer, but again on the north side of Bloor. And we were just like stuck, and it happened apparently to a bunch of people who attempted to go to the screening. You missed it though, Kaveh, the parade, but you made it for the film because the highway took you around, right?
Yeah, I'm one of those cinephiles that between the choices of seeing the Santa Claus parade and seeing Mohammad Rasulullah film, I chose the film. But you guys apparently went to see the Santa Claus parade.
Yeah.
The one thing I didn't get about the film at the end is, and a slight spoiler for you, is I didn't realize that like a 10,000 volt fence could actually hold a Tyrannosaurus Rex in its enclosed cage. And I thought that part was a little bit unbelievable. But I'll let you guys watch the movie yourselves and come to a decision. Why don't you introduce our guest and I'll do a bio.
Today on the podcast, we have a prolific filmmaker, one of my closest friends, one of Kaveh's closest friends, Jasmin Mozaffari. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, friends.
Well, hold on. Jasmin Mozaffari is a film and television writer and director. Her feature, Firecrackers, premiered at TIFF in 2018. In 2019, Jasmin won Best Director at the Canadian Screen Awards, and Firecrackers was named a New York Times Critics' Pick. Jasmin's short film, Motherland, based on her father's time in the U.S. during the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, won Best Canadian Short Film at TIFF 2023 and 2 Canadian Screen Awards this year. Now we can say welcome to the show, Jasmin.
Thank you, Kaveh. Hi, Farhan.
Hi.
Hi. Long time no
Farhan, we
see.
didn't tell you this. This is going to be an intervention. This is going to be an intervention for you for hating Christmas. What's wrong with you?
Christmas sucks, and it made Jasmin and I both late.
Late. We missed it entirely.
Seed of the Sacred. Yeah, we missed it.
What was the cutoff for you, Jasmin, that you were like, we hit this mark, and if we hit this mark, I'm not going to go into the film?
30 minutes. Yeah, once you've missed 30 minutes of any film, I would be like, if it was my film, I'd be like, see it another time. You've missed key setups, you've missed key characters. It's too late.
Yeah. Imagine if someone's 30 minutes late from Motherland.
You'd miss the whole film. It's over.
Yeah.
Jazz, can you talk a little bit about your upbringing as an Iranian Canadian living in Barrie and how that maybe influenced why you wanted to become a filmmaker, if it did, if it didn't? Like, give us a little autobiography, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I was born in Saskatchewan, and then we moved to Ontario, and my dad was from Iran, from Tehran. He's passed away now, but he came when he was like 19-ish to the US and then moved to Canada. He met my mom, and then they met in Saskatoon. I was born there. And then we moved to Ontario and eventually settled in Barrie, where I mostly grew up in Barrie, which is an hour outside of Toronto, a very conservative town. I always say to Americans, it's like the Walmarts and Applebee's kind of version of a Canadian town. There's not really much culture there. Certainly there was very little Middle Eastern people there, really no Iranians, a few. my cousins came from Iran later, but they were not in Barrie. So I was very kind of alone. Not to mention this was like the post 9/11 period, which is really where my teenage years were spent, in like the Bush years. Kind of in this weird place where I was connected to my Iranian roots in a way because my dad was very proud to be Iranian and always told me and my siblings, be proud of who you are. And before he died, he like wrote me a letter and said, never forget who you are, like Mufasa. Remember who you are. So I always think about that, but he didn't teach me Farsi, you know? So there was always this arm's length distance from culture, Persian culture, because, you know, like any culture, how can you fully immerse yourself in it if you don't really speak the language? So I kind of grew up definitely a lot around my Persian family who immigrated here, but, you know, it'd always be me and my siblings being like, you know, salam, you know, merci, hodafez, hormasabzi, like here's the words we know. But like my grandmother, my mom Bzorg, like lived with us and raised me as a young kid, but then she moved away. So I was always around the culture. I just couldn't fully immerse myself. And not to mention, there was this feeling of wanting to distance myself from it. And also my dad's feeling wanting to distance himself from it because of his experience post-hostage crisis, my experience post 9/11, the incredible racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia and all of that happened after. And it was just not cool to be Middle Eastern, which I'm sure you guys can relate to as well. So, you know, it didn't find its way into filmmaking practices until I was in my 30s because I didn't really feel like I had any claim to it. But I think I found my niche because I realized I was like, you know, I can come at it from like a diaspora point of view. I've never lived in Iran. I've never been to Iran. That's not your lane. My lane is this mixed identity person point of view, diaspora point of view. That's the view I can take on my films if I'm going to talk about anything Iranian.
You've specifically talked a lot about Andrea Arnold and how much you love her work and the influence it's had on your own vision as a filmmaker. Can you just talk a little bit about why you're drawn to Andrea Arnold and if there is a through line at all through like her style of filmmaking versus yours, just for the audience who might not be as familiar with her work?
I think like certainly as like a filmmaker post film school and during film school, actually, Andrea Arnold had a huge influence on my work. She's like a social realist director. And even before that, it was like Italian neorealism a lot. So I think Italian neorealists influenced her. She influenced me. You know, it was like a continuous thread. And I think Kiarostami like fits a little bit into that too. It's just like this feeling of this kind of slightly gritty realism, especially with Andrea Arnold, that really appealed to me. And then just like the female characters feeling real to me for the first time, maybe, especially as a teenager or like in my 20s watching her film Wasp and being like, oh, these women feel real to me. Fish Tank, these women feel real to me. Because, you know, we grow up as women, especially me growing up in like the late 90s or in the early 2000s, like where was the cool representation of women? It was so few and far between. So to see like this like girl in Fish Tank who like just said and did whatever she wanted and it felt so realistic, I was like really drawn to that. And then of course that worked its way into like Firecrackers, which is my first feature. But I think now my way of filmmaking has changed. It's become a little bit more formalist because Motherland's not like Andrea Arnold at all. It's not like my other work at all. So I think I'm always growing and changing as a filmmaker, but I certainly love her and will always love her work.
And when you mentioned Kiarostami as well as influence on your work, was Kiarostami kind of the first Iranian filmmaker that you were exposed to? What was your journey like in diving into Iranian cinema? Was that something that was your dad into it? Did you watch it with him, or was that something that you kind of discovered on your own later? Definitely
on my own later, like way later, because my family isn't very artistic at all, like the Iranian side of the family. My dad didn't he liked music, but he was not an artistic guy. He was like a family doctor. It's all about practicality, you know, be a doctor, engineer, lawyer. And like everything else is, you know, but he did have an artistic side. I think he just suppressed it. But yeah, we didn't grow up watching like Kiarostami films at all. I discovered that later. I think my first exposure though to Iranian cinema was probably Farhadi, probably. And then I started diving into it, but it was late in my career, like way late. And also the other thing for me is because I don't understand Farsi fully, I can really only watch Iranian films that have subtitles. So I can't, like, it's hard for me to do like a deep dive into the archives of Iranian cinema if I can't find a film that has subtitles. But yeah, now I feel like now that's more of an influence on me than it was when I was like in film school.
One of the things I find very interesting about your story as a filmmaker is how much I actually see parallels with my own experience as an Iranian, because my dad had a similar thing. My parents had very opposite. Like, my mom really embraced Iranian culture and loved it and went back often, but my dad rejected it wholeheartedly after leaving and fleeing, rather. He was in exile. So I kind of grew up in my teens not liking my Iranian identity, and it wasn't until quite later in my life, and this is part of what the purpose of this podcast is for me personally, is to get a better understanding of the things that I had tried to reject for so long. And I'm curious because for me, I did make this conscious pivot to start telling Iranian stories in my writing because it mattered to me. And I can't really figure out what it was, but I'm curious if you know, was there a turning point, and what was that turning point for you that kind of unlocked something about wanting to tell these stories after growing up in maybe a household that wasn't necessarily encouraging it as much as other Iranian households might?
I think there was like a few things. I think after my father died, not immediately, because he died when I was 26, and I'd already made the short for Firecrackers. I hadn't made the feature. I think after I made the feature of Firecrackers, I was like, okay. And then thinking about him, because I think maybe you can relate to this, Kaveh. I think the grieving process is weird. It's strange. It's not like a linear thing. Because I think I like felt there's like a few years where you're just like maybe numb or processing it, and then like later you're like, I don't know, for me I wanted to like feel closer to him, and I think that was a way to feel closer to him was through just, and also because like I said, he really told me like kind of after death through writing to never forget who I was, like to always be proud to be Iranian, because I think he knew that there was this like tenuous relationship with being Iranian for him and for us, like his children. So I think he realized he needed to put it in writing, because I think he might have regretted how distant he made us. So he wrote it down and said, like, he like was a very practical man and said, like, here are the things to remember after I die. There's like 3 things. And one of them was, you're Iranian, never, like, be proud of that. It's such a beautiful culture. Never, like, you have family all over the world, make sure you connect with them. And I think it's just getting older too. Like, you know, going into my 30s, you're not really trying to be anybody else except for you. Like, I think for me, like, I'm like, no, man, who am I? Like, this is, and then I started to meet other Iranian filmmakers. Like, Farhan is a big part of my connecting with my roots. Like,
Lies. Propaganda.
When do we meet? Late 2019.
No, 2018.
Well, we started really hanging out late 2019, right before the pandemic. And then I think he kind of really encouraged me and then introduced me to other people like you, Kaveh. And then other, you know, just my network of Iranian filmmakers and artists grew. And then I was like, oh, I feel at home now with this. And that was encouraging.
So that being said, why don't you lightly like touch on what today's film is and why you chose it? Because obviously there's a lot that resonates with you and a lot of parallels between you and Sierra. And why don't you talk a bit about that before we do a longer discussion on it?
Yes.
And how did you find out about this film? Because you told me about this.
Okay, so today's film is Joonam, directed and written by Sierra Urich, who is half Iranian, half American. I found out about this film, I think, because I follow what plays at Sundance, and this was a Sundance doc. And, you know, just through Instagram, if you follow certain Iranians in film, it would start to get promoted and pushed out into the world. Arian Moayed is the executive producer of Joonam, or one of them, and he's also the executive producer of Motherland, my short film. So I think I was probably following him and then started to see it. But I saw this at the University of Toronto. It had one screening in Toronto. And Farhan was there with me. And also my cousin Kiana was there with me, who's 7 years younger than me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Came from Iran when she was 13. And like, we have very different, we even look kind of the same, but we have quite different lives. But I was so happy to see it with her because we just like, you know, the grandmother in this is exactly like our Mama Bazorg. Exactly. So I'd seen it there and I was just like, this is my life, man. This is me. This is me on screen. I've never seen that before. And I was so excited. So I begged Farhan. I said, if you want me on your podcast, I need to do Joonam.
Let me begin with a plot summary for Joonam by Sierra Urich. Spurred by a provocative family memory and a lifetime of separation from the country her mother left behind, a young filmmaker highlights the narratives of strong-willed Iranian women as the documentary explores the relationships between 3 generations of women through the lens of Iranian-American director Sierra Urich. Filmed in Vermont, Urich sets out to reconnect with her Iranian heritage and learn the Farsi language. Despite her limited connection to her Iranian roots, she digs deeper into her mother and grandmother's stories to understand her own identity. It has a 90% Rotten Tomatoes score and no audience score because I guess that Rotten Tomatoes is weird and confusing that way. Maybe not enough. I don't know, whatever.
Also, docs in general get fewer views than scripted, and indie docs especially get fewer views. So
I ask you, Jasmin Mozaffari, what did you think of Joonam?
I love this film. I really love this film. I mean, it's hard. I'm not going to be able to talk about this film without relating it back to me because it's so much. There's so many parallels with my own experience throughout this, and also the feelings portrayed in this film feel like my feelings in a way that I've really rarely seen on screen. So that's why I really love it. And then I also just think the filmmaking cool. I think that there's something interesting and simple about the way that Sierra uses images and sound and score to do a documentary. You know, it's not a typical documentary. It's not like talking heads and, you know, voiceover over it. Like it's she's doing it in a very lyrical sense, like in a very impressionistic sense that I find actually feels more truthful to me.
Yeah, one of the first things that stood out to me right away was how little hand-holding it was doing for a documentary. And it was the first note I made because I went in as cold as you can. Like I knew, just based on knowing your life, Jasmin, I had some sense that it was like a parallel in some regards, but I didn't know what this was going to be about and how it was going to unfold. And 20 minutes in, I had this profound moment of, I'm so interested in everything I've seen so far. The cinematography is beautiful. I'm engrossed, and yet I don't know what the story is yet. Like it takes like a good 20, 25 minutes before you're like, what's the story we're following? Like I get elements of it, but I don't know what and it kind of just, like you said, without talking heads, it just kind of like allows the characters and vignettes to sort of slowly do these paintbrush strokes of revealing what the story is going to be. And I thought that was really beautiful. It was charming, very charming.
On a second watch, when you go back, you can find the seeds that are being planted early on in the film so that once you've seen it once, you can go back and be like, oh, I know what this is about. It's about the relationship between these 3 women from these 3 different generations and how they kind of relate to each other. The foundation for that is laid at the beginning of the film as well. Yeah. Which isn't necessarily as clear on your first watch, but I think it's done like that intentionally.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on because the cinematography, like you said, Jasmin, it's impressionistic. And one thing I thought was really interesting as a narrative tool was how often we're hearing someone having a discussion somewhere, and it's not related to the cinematography that we're watching because it's not using a talking head. It's almost like she's using the juxtaposition of what's being said and what's being shown to kind of like combine and give context to world and character. So it's never like if someone's talking about a garden, it's not necessarily showing a garden in that scene. It's almost like someone's talking about a garden, but they're showing old photographs or something. Yeah. And that would say something, I don't like, collectively it's saying something greater than the sum of its parts. And I thought that was a really interesting choice. Like she's a very, it's like you could see the really deliberate direction that she's doing in this film.
Yeah, because I've also watched it twice, but I started to, and I made a note about this. I just felt like there was a contrast between like the softness of like the idyllic Vermont American life and sometimes the voiceover of what was going on in Iran. Like there was definitely felt like a deliberate, like the softness of the imagery versus like, the grandmother speaking about a dagger going into her grandfather or father. Yeah. And it's like there was a constant contrast. It felt like at the beginning, especially maybe the first like half of the film or even 3/4 of like talking about Iran and then like showing Vermont as like a pastoral sort of place. And I think it's like, I felt like that was like the contrast between like the life that they set up and the life they left behind, which I thought was cool. Because I mean, she has a lot to film in Vermont. It's like, what a beautiful property and it has like this eeriness to it. There's some shots that are in the mist. There's shots of her walking out into fields. And it's like, there's this kind of, like her walking out into the fields, like she's always alone, you know, she's like this, like her space, but she's kind of always isolated.
Yeah.
There's this feeling of isolation and where she's away from her family. And then with her family on the property, there's some more warmth, you know, when the three of the women are together in the garden and everything.
Yeah.
So it's very like visual artist kind of way, like a painting or something like that, you know?
Yeah. Well, and even the structure of how she's deciding to unfold information, it's so, like I used the word earlier, I said she doesn't hold your hand, but it's also like there's a deliberate omission of information too. Because you're often feeling like there's more to every story you're hearing. So much so that I think there's like deliberate artistic choices she's making to conceal information. One of the things I was going to ask you, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead too much here, but there's a point when the grandmother's talking about the execution of her grandfather and the subtitles switch to Farsi.
Yeah.
And if you don't understand Farsi, you're literally being cut out of certain details of the story.
Yeah.
She and it's weird because it was during, like, there's a lot of like, you can see there's apprehension between the mother and grandmother to talk about certain details about the past, whether it's for political reasons, safety, whatever the reasons are. But it's like, there was these moments also when like the visual elements will just completely cut to black. And you're seeing punctuated lines of their conversation with just text underneath and you're hearing it. And I thought that was like a really interesting artistic choice to make, because it almost divides the audience to what information you're getting depending on what context you already know about the history of Iran.
Yeah. Well, the whole film feels like it's very much her perspective, looking and hearing and listening and experience on all of those. It's not her grandmother's perspective. It's not her mom's perspective. It's her perspective, even in the way she looks at objects and discovers. It's the same way I looked at Persian culture, you know, within the context of a Western house. You know, like going through your house, and I remember like seeing these little things around that my dad had brought from Iran. Like the past is there in the bookshelf.
Yeah.
You know, and I felt like the whole film is from her perspective. So I felt like when she cut out and changed to Farsi subtitles, because her mom was no longer there to translate for her.
Yeah.
So it's like now we're experiencing it through her, if you're like me, or if you're like, don't speak Farsi. So I thought that was a deliberate, like, she's like, you need to experience this kind of through me.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said too about the details in the house, like just for the people who haven't seen the movie yet, it's not just like these wide shots where you're setting the setting. With intent, she has close-up shots of these little details in the house. You know, like you'll see the sabze growing, like she's growing the wheat for Nowruz. It's not hand-holdy like Kaveh said either. These things are happening, these little details are there, and if you don't have someone beside you to tell you what that's for, you're getting kind of a similar experience to someone who's learning these things for the first time, right? That the context there being that the grandma's growing these things to give them out to people in anticipation of Nowruz, right? Or like the details on the wall all have some kind of meaning or representation or history or whatever. But if you're a character in that situation or in that scenario that isn't as familiar with that side of their identity, then you're just seeing these things as little interesting details without context.
Could you talk about, Farhan, this idea that certain information is being kept from us out of fear of safety concerns?
Yeah.
And you said there's something about them being Baha'i, which isn't even touched on as much as I thought it would be based on like the text I was reading from you before I saw the film.
Yeah.
Because again, she's very deliberately keeping certain things out of focus. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on this idea of the secrecy around the past with the family.
So my initial thoughts on the film, I really liked it. Obviously, I'm not half Iranian, but I found a lot of similarities between my life and Sierra's, a big one being that I grew up in a Baha'i family. I was born and raised essentially in exile. My parents had to escape Iran. A lot of our family members were persecuted in Iran because they're Baha'is, and still to this day that happens. So hearing these stories and these little tidbits of stories throughout the film was something that I really resonated with and really connected with. And I felt very seen in that regard, because even within like Iranian cinema, we don't really explore Baha'i identities. And even in this film, it's still very subtle. Like, she's not spending the movie talking about what is the Baha'i faith, where are Baha'is from, who are Baha'is, all this stuff. but she does touch on the persecution. But it was really cool to see, you know, Baha'i symbols in the film and portraits of prominent members of the Baha'i community, things like that, kind of sprinkled throughout the film. One thing I wanted to touch on was Sierra's mom in the film. She talks about how these stories of torture and persecution really messed her up as a child. And I know a lot of, not kids anymore, but I know a lot of Baha'is who, when they were kids, like, these were our bedtime stories. Like, our parents told us, like, yeah, this person was like, had parts of their body were like carved out and like candles were placed in and they were pulled through the street, or like this member of our family had all their like fingernails and toenails were ripped out. Someone was
Why was this a bedtime story of all times of the day?
Because I think part of it was to show, like, in the face of persecution and in the face of some kind of like torture or whatever, that you need to stand by truth and you need to stand by what you believe as right.
But is bedtime the best time to tell the story?
I think part of it is like, naturally bedtime is like a time where you're like alone with your kid and you're putting them to sleep or whatever it is. But I wasn't listening to those stories and being traumatized by it. I was listening to those stories and I was like very moved by the strength and resilience and steadfastness of people who like believe something and someone comes up to them and says, hey, lie or say that you're not this or whatever, or we'll kill you. And they'll be like, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to lie. Like, I need to stand by what I believe, and it's on you if you want to do something about it or not. And I held on to that dearly. Do you know what I mean? Not just about being a Baha'i, but about other things, like trying to like stand up for what I thought was right in different situations. But a lot of Baha'is I know were absolutely traumatized by this. So seeing Sierra's mom being traumatized by this and deliberately withholding and sanitizing certain historical context about their family and their upbringing, it makes sense to me why she would do that. And it's interesting to dive into a film where you explore that next generation who wants to uncover that and whose grandparent wants to tell them about it. But you have this intermediary generation that's like, I'm sorry, but like, I can't let you say these things because it's going to endanger my daughter's life. And when she's saying that, it's in this like beautiful like Vermont backdrop, like Jasmin was saying, but she's like whispering this to her in the middle of the night as if it's like, as if some like imam is going to jump out of a bush and like attack them. You know what I mean? But it builds that scene and that tension so well. And I think the fact that she can build that tension in this like random like farmhouse in like Vermont or like suburban Vermont or wherever they are is a testament to her filmmaking prowess.
But isn't that the story of all of us, like with our Iranian parents, especially from that generation, just afraid, like being governed by fear, even in Canada, you know, like all my family members, I could relate to this feeling of like when she's at when Mitra, the mom, is at the hairdresser and they're like, well, what if your daughter just went back? And she'd be like, I feel sick, you know? And that's my family too. And I'm not Baha'i, but like, they were just like, don't go back. It's never, yeah. And also the teacher, her like Farsi teacher, the first one, says the same thing. Like, now's not a good time. And it's just this whole narrative I've heard my entire life, this whole thing, oh, now's not a good time. When's a good time? Never. There's never a good time. And, oh, you're a filmmaker, so now it's like you're in danger. And this feeling of like not being able to talk about the past. Like, I'm still learning about things to this day. I didn't even know my grandfather was also murdered. I didn't know he was murdered until I was older.
He was assassinated, wasn't he?
He was assassinated because he was a socialist, and it's even the details around that are murky. I think this is part of the culture, at least, and I think it's our generation who's trying to bring light to it finally, to not live in the secrets anymore. What I like in the film is when Sierra, she's never gone, she's trying to, and I relate to this so much, the Google map scene of placing the little orange guy on these, and then it not because Google can't go around there, but also just like, that's what I've done that.
Yeah, me too.
Because it's us wanting to feel connected to, you know, a place that is such a big part of who we are, but we can't go. Like, that's so many other cultures, so many other people can go to their heritage place.
The one thing I thought was worth exploring, and I'll get into more in deeper analysis, is the idea that it gave me the sense of nostalgia for a place I've never been to,
Yeah.
which is like a profound feeling. It's a very bizarre feeling too. And the moment I felt it the most was when her tutor is giving like a cell phone live feed of like her walking the streets of Tehran.
Yeah.
And like I felt nostalgia. I felt like I was overwhelmed with emotion because it was like this weird moment of I miss that place, but I've never been there.
I think part of it too is hearing the grandma for Sierra, or like in my case, it was my parents. The grandma, a couple times in the film, when she talks about her childhood, or she talks about her parents, or she talks about her upbringing in Iran, she paints these very beautiful scenes when she's speaking in Farsi. Because in Farsi, she can be more articulate, right? Like she's not speaking with broken words here and there. She's painting these scenes. Do you know what I mean? Like the descriptives that she uses to be like, oh, everyone was around, everyone was laughing and smiling all throughout the night and whatever. She's giving this elaborate storytelling mechanism being used to really like transport you to a specific time and place, which because of experiences that we've had like that with our families telling us these stories, that's why I think that tour through Tehran feels nostalgic for a place we haven't been, because we've heard these stories of these places being painted for us our whole lives, of this land far away that we come from, and this story that like, oh, one day, now is not the time, one day you'll be able to return to this promised land and all this stuff. Jazz, did you have any link like that with your grandma or your uncles? Like, did they ever spend time telling you stories of like their childhood and Iran and the market and this and that? Like, was that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, they had so much pain towards Iran, so they often talked about a lot of the bad things. But, you know, my father, I think he had this nostalgia for the Caspian Sea in the north of Iran, Gilan, because that's where my family really originates from before they moved to the city. I really think that he had these memories in his mind of the Caspian Sea. He talked about the Caspian Sea so much.
Oh, wow.
That's where he spent his summers as a child. And I think like places like Tehran had like a negative association to him. It was the landscape outside of Iran. And in Canada, he was forever chasing places that reminded him of the Caspian Sea.
Wow.
At one point, we lived on a lake because I think it reminded him of being there. And he just always wanted to feel that. And then obviously talking about like the bread, like how the bread was made, like, you know, like I think he was talking about like barberry, like made in the ground.
Yeah.
You know, like not in the oven. He's like, oh, when I was young, we used to go and like get the bread out of the ground and do that. Like these sorts of things were his happy place. His memories were about that, less about people, probably because people, there's a lot of pain in that.
Kaveh, what about you? I know you said your dad obviously felt a lot of heartbreak. Your mom, did she ever creatively paint a scene of like what it was like, what she felt, what she saw, what she heard, any of that?
Does she ever? It's funny because like you asking that question, it's because you clearly haven't met my mother before, but like literally she'll do this. She did it last night. She'll do it again tomorrow. Every story, whether or not it's directions to get to Costco, will lead to like a painted image of like what the meadows of Kuhan look like. I can't, like, it's to the point where it's a major detriment to us having a conversation because I think like she's not a filmmaker, but I realize I get that element of her because she's such a natural storyteller that everything ends up becoming an anecdotal story about something that happened in the past that's painted with flowery images.
It probably, I think a lot, like in a lot of cases, this can be like almost like a hereditary trait. Like my parents are both very good storytellers and setting scenes, especially my father. And Sierra's grandmother is very good at it. And the way that she tells these stories, it's like another filmmaker would recreate the stories that she's telling through animation with the voiceover. Sierra doesn't do that. Like when the grandma's talking about the first night that she has her period, Sierra intentionally shows this shot of like she's showing all these dark shots of the garden. And then when she mentions getting her period for the first time, she focuses in on this red flower blooming in the middle of the garden, which I think is very intentional storytelling. And I think that you could probably draw a very clear line from Sierra's grandmother's storytelling ability to hers.
I love the grandmother. She was incredible. Just so loving and charming and came off as such a great person.
Yeah, I love her.
I do want to talk about the final scene. I liked the documentary until it got to the final scene, and it propelled me to loving it. Because I thought that final scene, starting from the fight that she's having with her mother to moving the camera there, and then she places the camera and comes in the frame and starts like washing her face in the sink. Everything there was so moving, and it felt like a moment of actually like filmmaking. Like I was like with a really deep analytical eye. I was debating whether or not I believe this was a staged moment or not.
Yeah.
But the grandmother interjecting, calling from the other room, should I come out or not? And them having a fight, and then them being forced to break into laughter because of what's happening resonated so accurately to what my family's like.
Yeah.
Same.
It's like, especially my relationship with my mom is like, we have these fights and then something happens and we break into laughter. And it was the most honest portrayal of an Iranian fight or Iranian family cultural exchange that I've ever experienced on film. And I loved it. I thought it was like genuinely masterpiece filmmaking, whether or not it's to a certain degree staged. Maybe none of it is. Maybe it's all entirely natural. But the idea of like this experimental documentary filmmaking, and here's like a moment that she's really going to linger on. It's like probably the longest scene of the film too, if you include, because not just the sink washing scene, but it's like she follows her mom into the room. It's like probably like a 7-minute scene. Yeah, exactly. And I was like left pretty breathless with that scene because I was like laughing and feeling the emotional weight of the scene. So I loved it.
Jasmin, didn't you find the blocking in that last scene was like, I know it's like weird to call it blocking because it's real life, but like it almost felt like it was like an expertly blocked or choreographed oneer in a lot of ways.
Well, I think Sierra did that throughout. It's like, who does she show and who does she not show? Because often you don't see her until that moment. Then it's all about her.
Yeah.
I just found it funny because I'm like, that is my grandmother. Like just calling from another room at a moment that's inappropriate to be like interjecting. Like, and I saw it with Kiana, my cousin. So we were laughing because it was like, that's literally our experience. Like, you know, like just always interjecting at a moment of tension.
Yeah.
To break it. But I think I was starting to wonder too, like, what's it like? Because this is not an experience me as a fiction filmmaker has, to be on camera yourself. There's an awareness of the camera. There must be, right? Like, no matter if you want to pretend it's. So it's like, I was curious about that moment for Sierra where she says, don't you dare, right? Like,
yeah.
When there's a camera there, did she forget there? Like, how could you react? I don't know what that experience is like because I'm always behind the camera. So that was a question that came up for me there.
Yeah. The last thing I have to say about just my initial thought, the music in the movie was so good.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Score.
Not just the diegetic choices of songs and like, and when the mom and the grandma are singing the songs and the lyrics fit the film so well, but also, yeah, like you said, Jazz, the score was incredible. I thought it was like licensed music, and it might be like licensed from some obscure library somewhere, but I tried Shazamming some of the songs because I was like, oh my goodness, this is good. It was so good.
There was a composer.
Yeah.
There was a composer. But I'm like, to me, the score really feels like it's elevating it to a place that it feels extremely cinematic. And like the score is like a bit sad. And I always think it's interesting when you make like a film about Iranian people. I actually respect her for this, to like kind of refuse the temptation to use like Middle Eastern instruments. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to just use like, and I actually felt like that was quite nice because that is like, to me, this is like the beginning of a wave of diaspora filmmaking where there's a different approach to how we look at our stories here in North America and like what score we use because through a white filmmaking lens in the past, when you see some of these Middle Eastern films made by white filmmakers, there's always that like sitar playing. There's always some like, yeah,
it's Orientalist music. Yeah.
Yes. And I felt like she maybe, I don't know if that was intentional, but I like that she didn't go that direction.
It must be intentional, right? Because that's her identity. Yeah. Like she would know not to use, and the couple times that she like does use the quote unquote Middle Eastern music is like, it's I think like a santur or a tar or something, which are actually Iranian instruments, and it's very purposely used and it's very stripped back. It's very like it fits the scene. And to that point too, she's not afraid to play with different genres of music as well in the film. Like the montage of her growing up which was so beautiful. Like it shows her mom when she's pregnant and then holding her as a baby, and then Sierra takes the camera, and then now the movie completely shifts to her POV. She's like filming her feet and she's like a little kid, and then it match cuts to her filming her feet and she's a little older, and as she's getting older and older, it gets more and more exciting, and the music ramps up and builds up through this like 80s, 90s inspired, especially 90s inspired score in that scene. And it's very different than like the more cinematic stuff at the beginning or some of the Iranian stuff later. Like I commend her for playing with those different genres. It's a lot of people would be afraid to do that, I think.
Okay, behind the scenes in trivia, I feel like we're also at one point going to be just talking to Sierra, so she'll be able to fill in a lot of the details of what she's willing to share. Farhan, if you have stuff you want to include here, take it away.
A couple things that I noted. The genre of this film falls into a very niche form of documentary filmmaking called the escarpment school of filmmaking. I don't know if Sierra did that intentionally, but it is a genre of documentary filmmaking which skirts the line of experimental, which originates in Ontario, actually. So shout out to that. It's this idea of taking what makes an escarpment film is where you take found family footage and you intercut it with new footage that you've taken, and it relies especially on the juxtaposition of themes, whether through taking old footage and playing new audio over top, or new audio with different kinds of scenery that wasn't necessarily meant for it, but it's mostly through using family archival footage to build this like experimental documentary. So shout out to that. The film by credit, like where at the end of the movie you'll have like a film by, is shared between the three primary subjects of the film. They're shared between Sierra, her mom, and her grandmother. So a little BTS tidbit for you. The other thing I'll say is I had been doing extensive research on Sierra's family history, and I had been finding tons of stuff, and Sierra asked me not to disclose it for safety reasons. So that explains why throughout the film there are these mid-conversation, there's hard cuts to black, is because it's censoring specific details about the family identity, which is done intentionally, one, to protect the identities, and two, because she wants it to feel a little more vague so that it's more accessible for lots of different people and families in similar situations. So one thing that I did do, similar to when we talked about blackboards and the deer, where we gave a little bit of historical context, I have a little bit of BTS information here about the persecution of Baha'is. The persecution of Baha'is has been ongoing since the 1800s. It's happened under the Qajar, it happened under the Pahlavis, and it happened under, obviously, the Islamic Republic. There was a period during the Pahlavi dynasty where it dipped a little bit, but institutional persecution of Baha'is was absolutely still there. In 1903, there were anti-Baha'i riots in Esfahan where over 100 Baha'is were killed. The government did not prosecute any of the rioters or in subsequent similar events. During the Pahlavi dynasty, institutionalized persecution of the Baha'i did lessen, but things like Baha'i marriages were still deemed unlawful, literature was still censored. And then in the 1950s, the Shah gave up a little bit of control. This was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, gave up a bit of control to the clergy in response to like a growing wave of like anti-Shah sentiments, I guess. He was trying to, I guess, throw them a bone. And in doing so, this led to the clergy spreading anti-Baha'i sermons. This was spearheaded by a guy named Sheikh Muhammad Taghi Falsafi, who was a populist Islamic preacher. His sermons incited riots, incidents of arson, torture, and killings. While these incidents were largely unprosecuted, the government did eventually pressure the clergy to stop these sermons for a time. The Hojatiyya was founded in the 1950s. They were a fundamentalist Islamic organization whose central aim was to combat the Baha'i faith. With the help of SAVAK, they continued campaigns of arrest, torture, and violence against Baha'is. And following the 79 revolution, persecutions of Baha'is ramped up, with hundreds being executed before the official policy of execution against the Baha'is was repealed due to international pressure. In 91, the Supreme Cultural Revolutionary Council, signed off by Ayatollah Khamenei stated that the increasing efforts to suffocate the Baha'i communities through a more silent means was the approach that would be taken. To this day, Baha'is are not granted proper citizenship. Their travel is restricted, barred from attending universities and colleges, and holding government jobs or work which requires government certification. And imprisonment and torture are commonly imposed on Baha'is to this day. That's it for behind the scenes and trivia.
Thank you, Farn. Critical reactions. This film did really well. It's an official selection at Sundance, as you had mentioned, Jasmin, Sydney Film Fest, Camden International Film Fest, Millennium 20 Docs Against Gravity Festival, and winner of the Portrait Documentary Award at the Cleveland Film Fest, winner of Best Documentary at Bentonville Film Fest. And one notable reaction was from Maria Gates from RogerEbert.com. Joonam is a heartfelt exploration of those living within a diaspora, the fractured connection each generation has to their own culture, and the irrevocable bond of shared roots. I just want to give that a shout out because, yeah. Deeper analysis, where we look at some of the larger themes at play. I mean, we've discussed a lot of it in quite detail during our reaction. My quick thing is I just wanted to come up with a term that I coined because I Googled it after to see if it exists. It gave me a feeling of transgenerational nostalgia, which is that thing that I mentioned that it's like feeling nostalgic for a place you've never been to. And watching that footage made me feel that way. Oh, yeah. And the reason I think this is interesting as a deeper analysis is I think we're one of the first generations to really be able to have this transgenerational nostalgia because of the wealth of access to like a staggering amount of live footage, pictures, videos. Yes, previous generations have had access to pictures and videos, but not to the extent that we have today. Right. So you can see live footage as streaming like Sierra does with her tutor. And I think that creates a weird psychological effect of we can really feel what it's like to live there without having lived there. And it makes us kind of get this, what I coined transgenerational nostalgia.
I like that.
So I thought that was a really interesting aspect of this film that I wanted to call out.
Yeah, I felt that too. Watching it pretty heavy. And then I also on the opposite side, like when she's watching the TikTok videos of the kids in Iran, which I also watch all the time.
I thought of you during that scene.
Yeah, it comes from this place of wanting to understand what it's like to live there now. And when I watch those videos, it makes me realize like how different we are too. Like how, because I think a lot of us have influence from our parents, and our parents left Iran at a time that's very much in the past now. Like Iran feels very different. And I'm sure if you talk to Iranians who have just come to Canada or they're still there, like their version of Iran and our version of the nostalgia of Iran, I think are very different things. And I think there's like the movie, the doc doesn't spend a lot of time examining this, but I think there is that like whole part of Iran we don't understand that these kids do. And, and I'm like, when I look at TikToks, I'm like, oh man, like if I went there, I'd be such a foreigner. Like, even though I'm half Iranian or any of us who are Iranian, we're really just be out of our element.
Yeah. I've talked to a number of Iranians who have gone back to Iran for the first time in like 30 years. And when they come back, they have a little bit of like an identity crisis because they have this notion of what Iran was, and they go back and the Iran that they left is no longer there. It doesn't exist anymore. So these individuals who have kind of tied their identity to that place isn't there anymore, and then they feel totally lost and in shock.
Yeah. Well, you see with Mitra, like her mom, like it's like she's carrying those memories in the pictures on her studio, right? It's like frozen in time. And I think like a lot of us live within that idea of Iran that's frozen in time. Like from before the revolution even, like I loved seeing those videos. It's amazing she has the videos of herself. Mitra has the videos of herself when she was like young in Iran dancing and like, wow, like so incredible. And it's like, but that doesn't exist anymore.
A couple things that I noted for deeper analysis. One is and I'd love to hear both your thoughts on this. I love how meta the film is. Like she's like constantly referring to the camera, like talking about where she's going to place the camera. She's like, do what you want with your face. I'll do what I want with the camera. Like there's like a part of the film where she's like messing around with the audio and she's trying to figure out which channel to set the microphone to, and all that's in the movie. She's setting up for an interview with the mom and the grandma, and we don't actually see the interview she does with them in the garden. The
Oh, yeah,
footage
that's a
that we
good
see is all the footage leading up to the interview, which is just the like mom and grandma and the daughter all like talking to each other casually. What were your thoughts on that? How did you guys feel watching that as filmmakers?
I like how she added humor to the film. There's humor throughout because of these exchanges that she's there and she doesn't understand what they're saying. It was only in the translation she got back where she's like, she must have laughed a lot reading the translation.
Yeah, I think that was just like speaks to its like experimental nature and how I didn't even realize that you don't see the interview in that moment. You're talking about in the garden, right? When they're like kind of setting up outside. But watching them set up for that interview said to me so much more than I think I would have learned from the interview.
Yeah.
I like really enjoy that scene a lot. So that's an interesting thing.
Well, I think it especially goes back to that sentiment that Sierra displays throughout the film, where the mom is constantly trying to present this like sanitized, curated version of their lives, right?
Yeah.
Like going back to that thing of do what you want with your face, I'll do what I want with the camera.
I was just going to say, and also the difference between how women view themselves in each generation, you know, like the mom being always concerned about how she looks on camera, and Sierra, I don't think really caring at all and being able to embrace. And then, you know what I mean? And like almost Sierra and her grandmother almost being more similar than Sierra and her mom.
That's what I was going to say. It skips a generation because of what they've been handed down. So like the grandmother probably expressed all this love and affinity for her culture to the mother, to Mitra. So she's been surrounded by it and doesn't have any curiosity towards it, and therefore has the privilege to be able to be like, I'm going to dash away with this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm going to tuck it away into a corner unseen. Then one generation goes down to Sierra, and she isn't hearing about this stuff growing up, which actually fuels her curiosity about it and actually makes it full circle, because now she wants to reach out to a grandmother who she cannot communicate with that well to learn about this stuff that has been withheld from her. And I was going to say, it's funny that it echoes so much what Jasmin and I have expressed with our fathers, was specifically this like deliberate, not necessarily withholding, but this like reluctance to discuss the past. And that maybe for a time in our lives,
these are like heartbreak and trauma, right?
Yeah. And that for a time in our lives might have made it, we were okay with that. But then as we grow older, it just fuels our curiosity more. Best scene, where we discuss our favorite scenes in the film.
You want to go ahead, Kabe?
Well, it'll be no surprise to you guys that my favorite scene in the film was the final scene. It crescendoed. It had like dramatic beats and turning points. And it was like beautifully written, quote unquote, even though it's probably all a natural, real moment. Or maybe it wasn't. Either way, it's impressive.
It's a great scene.
I don't know if I have like a favorite. I have a few favorites, but the one I really like the scene where the grandmother's talking about her grandfather being killed and how that's shot and the reactions off camera and that. And then I also just love the scene where Sierra confronts her mom about not being able to like connect with her grandmother or her culture because the mom has decided for her in a way to protect her about how she's let in and how she's not, because that is exactly what I experienced too. And the feelings that erupt from that, the feelings of anger and frustration towards your parents who did this is very real to me, because it's like, wow, you decided that for me. I didn't get to decide. I thought that was really good to include in the film.
Yeah. Mine is a two-way tie, 2 montages. One of them is Sierra growing up and seeing her in front of the camera, then she's behind the camera. I thought there was just so much energy behind it. I loved getting this insight behind the voice of the film. And I think it just like contextualized a lot of what we were seeing, as well as the montage of the mom growing up, using a lot of the found footage and the photos and some of the mom's VO over top. I thought both of those were beautiful and gave a lot of excellent context to who these characters are.
Yeah.
Something I'm just realizing now, the beginning of the film, when it shows the title of the film, Joonam is written with English letters. The end of the film, Joonam is written in Persian letters. It's cool, because it like kind of shows her evolution of like connecting with her heritage. That's really cool.
It's cool. Damn, that's poetry, where we pick out specific lines in the documentary that we liked.
It's when she's confronting her mom and she says,
I feel like I have been made an outsider because you are too afraid to let me have it.
It's this sentiment of really putting into like words the feeling I feel too. It's like I've been made to feel an outsider in my own culture. which is and I doubt that's something even Mitra ever even thought would happen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I felt that was very powerful to me.
I really love the moment when she realizes in post-production, she starts noticing like getting the transcripts back. And this is the line.
For most of it, I don't really know what's being said, and I had it sent out for translations. And I just got the transcript back. My grandmother, it's like meeting someone for the first time and experiencing the same moments again, but suddenly it really flushes out this like full picture of my grandmother, who I have known for my whole life, but suddenly it's like slightly different.
And it's like she's getting the transcript, so it's like all these moments that like the grandmother was saying things to her and she didn't understand it in the moment, but is now noticing all the nuances and the comedy and the character and all that stuff. I thought that was like very profound.
Yeah, it's very sweet.
Very, yeah.
And right after that quote, it cuts to that shot of them waking up in the hotel. And their grandmother says, you know, I've really enjoyed spending all this time with you. It was so sweet. And like you can just see Sierra in the moment being like, what is she saying?
Yeah. And it's really like it's a testament to the grandmother who like is still speaking with such adoration despite knowing that her grandmother doesn't understand it. But it's like the feeling of love from the grandmother is profound enough.
And
that
that's
it's like,
common too.
She might not understand what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
As a person who's grown up with a grandmother who also has that same love and adoration, I think for me, like that's like literally that experience is so true. And I think because we grow up listening to Farsi and not being able to participate. Like it's interesting to watch Sierra just like do what I did. You just kind of like, you're just totally okay with just like sitting there and being spoken to in a language that sounds so familiar to you because people have been speaking it to you since you came out of the womb. But you can't like, it's just like it's music to you, but you're just there absorbing it. Yeah.
My favorite line of the film, it's from Sierra's mom, Mitra. She says,
I have separated my life in Iran as one character, and my life here as another character.
Which I think really boils down who she is as a person. And I think that when we're seeing her do these things to curate, whether it's curate the experience for Sierra or like hiding different parts of who she is or not wanting to talk about things, she's really compartmentalizing things, I think, for her own sake and for her own sanity, right? And I think in the same way that she's looking back on Iran in a very distant view, she reflects on the view that she had of the United States prior to coming here, where it was like thought to be this world of like, you know, that concrete jungle and big cities and whatever. And she's like, no, it's actually very beautiful. There's rolling green hills. The people are kind. It's very serene and calm and all this stuff. It's interesting to really dive into those two aspects of her personality.
Totally. I like that. I think that's such a common experience for so many Iranians in general that I've heard, is that you become two different people. You have a split consciousness. That's kind of what she was talking about there.
Festival of Cons?
Well, yeah, we could do favorite performance. I mean, obviously not performance, but my favorite standout character was the grandma. I'm probably sure that's probably universal.
Yeah, me too.
Same.
Cool. Festival of Cons. Go ahead, Farhan.
The film missed an opportunity to comment a little bit on the United States. I thought, if anything, maybe the film was a little sanitizing of the American setting. Because we hear the mom say like, oh, it's beautiful here. It's serene and calm and all this stuff. But like, I think it's easy to say that when you're in like this rural area of Vermont. But I think it would have been nice to, you know, talk a little bit about what Iranians went through in the States post-revolution as well. She didn't not do, like, it's not like she made an opposite statement either. It just might have been a bit of a missed opportunity, I think.
Jasmin.
I'm also like, I don't know. I'm also like, it's not good to pack too much stuff into a movie. Maybe she did have it and cut it out. Who knows?
Yeah, that's fair.
Because, you know, you kind of want to, I don't have anything to nitpick. I think that everything felt right to me. Like I said, my questions are just like, at the end, is that when you have a camera on yourself as the filmmaker, is that fully genuine? Like, I don't know. Does it need to be? Do we care? There's so many ways to make documentaries. There's reenactments. There's, you know, so it was just more like questions I had, but it didn't bother me. You know what I mean? Like neither
of these things like bother. They're like These are like deep cut nitpicks for me. Like I'm like
Yeah.
really reaching.
Yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it. So
Yeah, the only thing, I don't have nitpicks either. I'm like more in line with Jasmine's camp of thinking, but I did, because I think everything was done with so much attention that it's not like there's a nitpick.
Mhm.
But in its execution, there's deliberately stuff that's being taken out of. There's some stuff that's just out of view of what we're seeing, and that's a deliberate choice.
Mhm.
But there are a few times, and I'd be like, well, that would have I would have liked to have learned a little bit more of context there, but they just gloss over it.
Mhm.
And again, it's a stylistic choice, so not really much to complain about. But one example too would just be like,
Yeah.
Gary gets shafted out of this documentary quite a lot. And to the point where at first I was like, who's that guy there? Until like a few seasons later, they described that Gary's in this too. And it just goes to say with 5 years of filming stuff, there must have been so much that hit the cutting room floor. Like you could probably make a second documentary of the stuff that she cut out.
Yeah.
And I would just be curious to know, it is a story about the 3 women and 3 generations of women who have like gone through this, but it just piqued my curiosity to know, like, how does Gary fit into all this? Like how much of a role did he play into, or maybe none at all, but how much did he play into like Mitra's sort of abandonment of a part of her identity or something? And again, maybe he didn't at all, but it made me curious. He just really became like a sidewalk role. He became like a walk-on part for this film.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point too, Kaveh, I actually didn't even realize that the grandfather made it to the US.
Yeah.
I just assumed for whatever reason that he died in Iran until like that one shot where they're in the airport.
Yeah,
And I was like,
yeah.
oh, the grandfather had a life
Basically,
here.
what Farhan and Kaveh are saying is that we could have really seen a lot more men in this film.
Yeah, we need
Where
more
was the
male
voice
representation.
in this? I'm just serious. Okay. Double feature lineup. If you were going to screen this, Jasmine, as part of a double feature lineup at a theater, what other film would you pair this with?
my God, I don't know. I didn't think.
Well, you have
prepare this
35 seconds to figure it out,
question.
and I'll come back to you. No, I'll go first, and you can think about it while you're here.
Yeah, go.
Farhan will go first.
I would pair this with A Kandahar Away, which is a documentary film by Dr. Aisha Jamal, who we previously had on the podcast. It's a documentary that she made with her family as the subjects, her and her family, where her father purchased this plot of land in Kandahar, Canada, and the whole family goes there together to discuss what they're going to do with it. They go to some local community events, and it's just another interesting introspective into a diasporic family that I think would pair very nicely with this one.
Yeah, I would go with one of 2 possible films. The first thing is I've said this a lot. I think this will be my 3rd time bringing it up as a double feature, but the documentary Iran Job, which Jasmine, I want to organize a screening one time when you are free to watch with Farhan, because neither of you have seen it. But it's essentially it's a documentary about a a black basketball player in the U.S. who ends up not making the NBA, so he has to be a journeyman player, which he plays in Europe, and then he plays for 2 or 3 seasons in the Iran League and falls in love with the country. And I think it's like a good like reflective access point from like this film about an American who travels to live in Iran. The other alternative would be to have a female director, would be to pair this up with something like Shada, directed by Noura Niasari, because it almost feels like the reverse of this again. It's a narrative film about an Iranian who's traveled outside of Iran, but it's all of the connections to Iran that are making it harder. It's like she's trying to find ways to disconnect some of the more toxic aspects of her past without going into too much detail. And
It's a great film.
I think those 2 would pair up nicely together in terms of themes, and both female directors there. So that would be my 2 picks.
What about Motherland? Motherland would be a good one to pair it with
The
too.
movie's fucking terrible. Don't even get me started.
Well, double feature, I would say the movie I was thinking of pairing it with would be Minari by Lee Isaac Chung,
That's a great film.
because they are both diaspora films, and Minari is really about a family who's settled also in farmland. I think in Iowa. I could be wrong where it is. It's definitely like a rural area of the US. And it's just another sort of experience of like generation, and there's multiple generations of Korean family in this film, and like how they both how they're trying to settle in America for the first time. And I think that there's like both the rural aspect of these people from different parts of Asia settling in rural U.S. and they're both very beautiful films.
It's Arkansas.
Arkansas.
But yeah, that's a great.
Oh, that's where they settle.
In Minari,
That's a beautiful film.
yeah.
I need to watch it.
Also beautiful score.
That's a great selection. Can this be a modern Hollywood remake? No. Although,
No.
I'm just curious about this. Jasmine, you're being offered $10 million to direct a narrative version of this film. What's the angle you're taking?
Oh yeah, then I'd do it.
What's the angle? What would be the pitch? What's the angle you take on this?
I don't think it would be that different of an angle than what Sierra's taken, honestly. I think I would just want to, because this is like, the way it's filmed is more experimental documentary. You would have to obviously do a more linear narrative approach to it. And I think just create, because I really like tension in films, just find ways to create tension in more of a narrative way. But I think you could also take reference from the way Sierra's filmed this. I think a lot about like Sound of Metal, because part of that takes place in like the middle of the countryside, and there's still lots of tension there. And I think like filmed in a similar way. Now you make me want to make a film like this. Starring Shore Ogdoshlu
As the grandmother?
as the grandmother. Yeah.
As long as Ben Kingsley gets a cameo as the grandfather,
My God.
then I'll give you $10 million.
Ben Kingsley's going to play Mitra. I want only my daughter. Cool. Final thoughts and grades. I give it this an A-. I think I spent I really liked the experimental style of filmmaking, and that's the stuff that attracted me most. As a piece of informative Iranian cultural tablet, I at times was getting worried that I'd get frustrated throughout. Like I spent a lot of the time of this film thinking about the film, and I think on second viewing I'll actually like it a lot more because I was worried about what it was saying about Iranians and what it was saying about Iran as a country. But once I allowed myself to detach myself with the socio-political aspects, I really started just falling myself comfortable into like this family of these three generations of women. And those were the strengths. It's just these people as characters and the creative choices to not hold your hand I really liked. And then when we got to that final scene, I was like, okay, this is fucking awesome. Like it really all comes together with this final scene. So it really won me over, and I would say A-. I'm a harsh critic.
Cool. Jazz?
For the record, I don't like grading other people's films, but I will give this an A. Like, I think it's great. I think I was very moved by it. I didn't like how obvious it was. There was a very careful hand of a director in this without being too controlling. And I've watched it twice. Loved both times. And I'm excited to see what Sierra does next.
Mm-hmm.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also gave this an A. I was teetering between an A and an A+. I think ultimately it's an A for me. I think it was genuinely a very beautiful film. The first time I saw it, it definitely brought me to tears. And I saw a lot of myself and my family in the film, obviously not from the perspective of like being half white, but from the perspective of, being essentially born in exile and having that association with the same kind of trauma that her family does. And it was really cool to see not just Iranian representation on the screen in the diaspora, but also Iranian Baha'i stories being told in a way which that is like a minority within a minority within a minority that doesn't get shown in film very much. And so I appreciated that quite a bit.
Another title of this could have been called Minority Report. Joonam, a touching look at intergenerational immigrant identity, is an especially timely meditation on what it means to be Iranian American in this moment. The film is a poignant, engrossing work, rich with surprising details that any number of audiences could embrace because its appeal isn't based in being a documentary. As Sierra Urich herself puts it, it's a portrait of a loss of home and how that loss of home ripples across generations. Farsi itself is a sore point in Urich's investigation. She cannot speak the language, while her grandmother Behjat's English is limited, and she fears that her relationship with her grandmother, while affectionate, is fundamentally impeded by this barrier. The object of making this film is not to educate viewers about the political or economic relations between Iran and the United States, but instead to offer a humanizing account of the injustices Iranian women face and how they battle against them in their everyday lives. Through 3 generations of Iranian women swapping lenses and perspectives, we see warmth and sadness, but also good humor at the core of the family dynamic. As Urich has said, I'm most hopeful that people see the authenticity of Iranians and the film when they watch it. but we celebrate Sierra's beautiful film, as ultimately we are left with a protagonist who has never traveled to Iran, but imagines some ungraspable insight might be gained from seeing it for herself. Though she's mindful of the dangers and impracticalities of such a trip, therein lies the quiet universality of this film, especially for Iranians within the diaspora. The eternal grasp for the nostalgia for a place we've never been, for a home we can never revisit, lingers and echoes in our hearts and minds eternally for what might have been. Jasmin, thank you so much for coming on to the CinemaRex podcast and talking so passionately about a film that means so much to you.
Thank you for having me.
And just wanted to point out to the audience and the listeners that Jasmin's most recent film, Motherland, is a Vimeo staff pick. It's available to watch on Vimeo right now. Please go ahead and watch it. A brief description: during 1979, at the height of the Iran hostage crisis, Babak goes on a trip to meet his fiance's parents and ends up confronting the realities of what it means to be an Iranian immigrant in a patriotic post-Vietnam America.
And with that, we are now going to cut to a brief interview with Sierra about the process of making this film and hopefully gain a little more insight on behind the scenes and trivia. Sierra, welcome.
Welcome, Sierra.
I'm excited to be here.
Before we dive into the nitty gritty, I have a very important question for you.
Okay, hit me.
Have you been keeping up with the Farsi
I
lessons?
know, that's the $1 million question. Tragically, I haven't.
Oh, no.
It was my New Year's resolution to start the classes back up again, so I've got like a month or so left to make sure that I don't break my resolution. So
Oh, resolution for this year.
for this year, so check with me at the end of December.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to what you said in the documentary when you heard your grandma for the first time, where you're like, it's like meeting someone for the first time, because it's when you can't articulate yourself in a language, you feel like you're trapped in your own body almost, you know?
I think it makes a difference too, even on the comprehension side.
Mhm.
Even if you have someone translating for you for meaning what someone is saying. In your native language, you have all of these emotional associations with word choice.
Mhm.
So when you don't have a conversation on a word choice level, it really limits the emotional capacity for connection.
Yeah.
And so when I got the subtitles back and I was reading in real time what my grandmother was saying, and a translator had made word choice selections that I could read in real time, it was suddenly a very different emotional connection rather than just,
Right.
oh, I know my grandmother is saying she loves me or she's communicating this idea. I am understanding the poetry of her words in my native language, which is English, which connects to me emotionally because it's the language that I grew up with as a child that, you know, love was expressed to me in. And so I think on both sides, it's, you know, being able to communicate complexity to someone else, but also being able to understand the complexity on an emotional level from someone. And so language is just like so complex.
Well, can I ask about that moment? Because I thought that was such an endearing, beautiful moment. I think it's such a strong thematic centerpiece to your doc, is this idea that when you were watching the editing footage, as we mentioned, you're getting a new understanding for just the things she was saying to you in the room. And you specifically chose that moment when you're both in your specific hotel room in the beds, and she's speaking with great endearment towards you. And I was really curious as an audience member what you were in, not in the editing phase, but what were you thinking to yourself in when you were lying in bed hearing her speak for the first time? Because I mentioned this in the pod when we talked to Jasmin too, is it's such a universal thing. Of my grandmother always would do that too, is despite the fact she knows there's this like fence between us, she would still always speak to me almost as if she's speaking to herself, but she would say the things that she felt in her heart, regardless as to whether I understood it. So I felt that was just a universal thing you captured. And I was just curious as to what were you thinking in those moments when you know your grandmother's speaking to you and you're both conscious of the fact that you're only catching bits here and there. Like in that moment, what were you thinking to yourself?
That's a really interesting moment to pull out. You know, I think it's just these like the sounds of comfort of family. I think more often, you know, my comprehension at that point in my life of Farsi was very minimal, but I knew generally the mood and the tone and the sort of deductive reasoning meaning of moments. Yeah, I know she's clucking about something in bed that is sweet, and I'm not really sure exactly what it is, but it's directed towards me, and so I can guess about, you know, maybe what sort of endearing grandmotherly things she's saying, but I don't know exactly what it is. And I, you know, so much of communication is that. It's nonverbal, it's tonal, it's body language, it's contextual. And so I think, especially in a family setting, when you have a guessable context of what might be going on around you.
A guessable context.
In the history of what your family often talks about. You kind of figure out generally what's going on.
Yeah.
But I think so much too, when I'm thinking about her perspective, and I think something that was really moving to me about that moment, something that actually an advisor said to me when I was showing a rough cut of the film, was it didn't matter to her that I wasn't understanding.
Yeah.
And the whole film is me trying to get closer to my identity, feeling kind of like an outsider, trying to get closer to my family through learning the language. But for her, it really didn't matter. It was just that we were spending time together. And it's such a moving thing to see, because here I am trying so hard my whole life to get close, to figure out my place and everything. And for her, it always existed. It was just about spending time. And so, I think for me, that's really what that scene is about. And the ability to communicate and express yourself doesn't always need the other person to understand necessarily. And I think with family, often you're expressing yourself and, sometimes you feel like your parents aren't getting it. But the ability to just express yourself, whether it's being understood or not, is often just as important.
Was there a specific thing about that moment that I'm sure when editing, when you want to express that moment of disconnect and realizing it, was there something specific about that hotel room scene that you were like, this is the scene I want to insert to show a clear-cut moment? Because I'm sure there must have been hundreds of moments like that.
Yeah, you could have placed it earlier with subtitles, but you chose to put it there.
Yeah, we chose to harken back to the hotel room of the beginning of the film, where there's a real disconnect between us as well. My grandmother's like not understanding the sound that's going on in the other room, and it's my mother. And that scene is in the beginning of the film is really much more from my perspective of here's my funny grandmother. I can't understand her. She doesn't get that there's a toothbrush going on. We can't really communicate about it. It's sort of my granddaughter perspective. Seeing her as this really limited figure, who I love deeply, but I don't know how smart she is. I don't know how funny she is. I don't know, her wit. Of course, I know she's an intelligent woman, but I don't have the ability to communicate intelligently, and so there's only so much I can understand. And the end of the film is really more her perspective. It's that same moment in the same hotel, and her communicating this really poignant thought that we've made up for lost time of not being together for so long, that this process of making this film together has really made up for lost time and brought us together. And she's saying it in this moment where I'm still having no idea what she's saying, but again, like I said, that part doesn't matter. It just matters that we spend time together.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's such a sweet moment.
When you were talking about translations and getting it back and word choice, it made me think about the scene where you ask your grandmother about her grandfather.
Yep.
The way that your mom translates things, and eventually, obviously, she shuts it down. She's like, we're not doing this, and she walks away, right? And then your grandma kind of concedes, and she's like, oh, nothing, like, he dies. Like, that's kind of the end of the story, and then that's the end of the conversation. But when watching it, there's a lot of interesting things that happen in the scene. One of them is the way that your mom translates some of the words. She sanitizes some of the words, or she changes some of the meaning. Like your grandmother uses the word martyr, your mom uses the word murder. And in the translation later, once your mom leaves the room, the subtitles are half in English, half in Persian, right? So if you're someone like Kaveh or myself, you get a clear picture of everything going on, and you get this dramatic irony. But for audiences like, for example, Jasmin, who reviewed the film with us, she felt that intentional disconnect there, So I'm wondering, one, how did you know that the translations that you got weren't also sanitized or biased by the word choice?
Yeah.
And two, did you later have a conversation with your mom, whether after you got the translation or after the film was released, about some of those moments where she translated things a little differently, and how did that go?
Yeah, big question. I think to speak first to just a creative decision about switching the subtitles to the Farsi Persian script instead of English. I really wanted there to be that disconnect for a non-Persian speaking audience, that I was cut out from the story at that moment because my translator, my mother, left the scene. And if you don't speak Persian, you're also cut out from the moment. And so I really wanted that to be a distancing effect, so that frustration to be felt on the audience level as well. But also that scene is something that we played with a lot creatively in terms of like a camera on, camera off technique, which was woven throughout the film and other areas, both as like harkening back to this film is also about the filmmaking process, but also using it as a device to protect people's privacy, because there are so many layers of that story. Some of which my mom really didn't want to be out in the open, or was worried about keeping people safe within Iran if too many details came out. That was something that we thought, okay, how can we convey that this story is moving forward, but use this camera on, camera off technique to both honor what the participants want in terms of information being divulged or not being divulged, and also use it as this technique to tell you more about like the process of what it's like to be in that room and to try and get stories out of your family and make a film at the same time, and all the frustrations of that. The other part of your question, in terms of the subtitles, it was a real challenge to subtitle this film. There was over 400 hours of footage. I think I used something like 5 or 6 different translators.
Wow.
And I had to subtitle the raw footage, not the finished film.
So that you could edit it.
So that I could edit it. And so that was a massive undertaking, and one that happened in stages because it's also very expensive.
Right.
So when we would get a grant or some funding come in, I would get the next batch of what I thought would be important footage translated.
Right.
And there was a process of going through to figure out, is this the right translation, which did help actually my Farsi lessons. So I knew enough Farsi to be able to pick out words, and I would be on Google Translate typing in Persian script what the word is to make sure that it's the right level of word choice. My mom and I actually ended up going through the whole film when it was finished, just to make sure on a word by word level that it was accurate. And that was something that I was frustrated with the entire time making the film, of like, are you actually translating what she's saying accurately on purpose? Or is it changing the meaning for your own methods? Or is it just that you're forgetting what she's saying because she's talking in this really long-winded way? I mean, it was a mess. It was a total mess making the film and trying to get that.
Yeah.
But stepping outside of that, to give credit to my mother, she really, the first time I showed her the film, she really came to it from an outside artist's perspective.
Oh, nice.
And she helped me a lot with this film, with the translations. And we were able to, I think that's really the power of autobiographical filmmaking. Once you're outside of the moment of being in the work or making work about yourself, you have this like incredible perspective to look back on your life. And my mom was able to do that as well. And so we were able to have a conversation about like, okay, why in this scene did you say murder and not martyr?
Right.
And why was this translated a little bit differently? And you're outside of the heat of the moment. And so you can have a more philosophical discussion about it. And there's so much to that word choice, right? Yeah. Like martyr is so different than murder, even though they can both convey the same sort of thing. There's a philosophical difference.
Okay, so you mentioned right now over 400 hours of footage, and I think I'd read online that this was shot over a period of 5 years. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was made over a period of 5 years. The filming was primarily in 2019.
Okay.
But there were some, pickup shoots on either side of that.
So with 400 hours of footage, was there ever an element to the final film that you had to put on the cutting room floor, despite you maybe were falling in love with it, or something that you really tried to hold on to the last minute, but you just felt it didn't fit with the story? Can you talk a bit about the stuff that just didn't make the final film that you were really precious about, but just had to make hard choices and edits?
Yeah. I mean, this film had so many different iterations of it.
Yeah.
At one point, the grandfather martyr story was like a backbone of the entire film. At one point, there was like a whole trip to Maine that happened where my grandmother eats lobster for the first time. And it was this very cute, hilarious scene.
That's so cute.
That's awesome.
Where she calls it eating accompanied by torture. That was a really beloved scene.
That's wonderful.
That cut.
Can I ask you about techniques? there's a beautiful moment in the garden. You're setting up for an interview with both your mom and grandmother, but I don't think we actually end up seeing the interview itself. And it was almost like the context of like the stuff leading up to the interview that was almost more revealing about the dynamic than anything you could have asked. And it didn't hit me till our conversation after. I'm like, oh yeah, we didn't even see that interview, but we all talked about how we loved that moment of setting up the camera and talking about where everyone should stand. That element was really interesting. And also the final scene, which to me, I thought was like a masterpiece of filmmaking. It really kind of brought everything together. That kind of one tracking shot of you following your mother, then going back to the sink and the fight you're having and your grandmother speaking in the other room, which made me laugh out really hard. And I just wanted to know, first of all, what was some of like the thinking behind those specific technical moments? And were you influenced by other documentary filmmakers that kind of like led you to try these different things? Because I really think those are the moments that really stand out and set it apart from other documentaries that might touch on similar topics.
Yeah, thank you for pulling out those moments, because those are also, I would say, my two favorite moments of the film.
Yeah.
You know, actually, to just sort of harking back to what we were talking about with the martyrdom story a little bit in talking about these moments, you know, I asked so many questions of my grandmother and the family history over the course of making this film, and my mother too. And it was really interesting for me, but there's only so much that you can hear of someone else's family story. You know, it's like listening to someone else's dreams. At a certain point, you're like, I don't care. This doesn't relate to me. This was interesting for a second, but now I'm bored. And so when we were trying to figure out, you know, what shape this film would take, you know, it was really a film that was rooted in the present of trying to understand a family history that you can't quite grasp and understand an identity that you can't quite grasp. And all those moments are coming out in the process of me trying to gather the stories, but the stories themselves are just stories, you know, that sort of relate to me, but in some ways they don't because they're history and aren't going to really relate to the audience because they're not your history. But what is relatable is this dynamic of trying to work with your family to understand something deeper about yourself.
Yeah.
And so we realized it was really all the setting up moments that were important. Yeah. And, you know, the martyrdom story is another example of that. It doesn't really matter what happened and who it was. What matters is that there was this exchange of wanting to know more and a family member trying to protect, you know, and there's this wall of protection that's built that then becomes a wall of exclusion or a wall of othering. You know, when I call it the great barber moment, where I'm like setting up this interview and we're in the backyard because there's this like really beautiful great barber that my mother tends. And so in my mind, it sticks out as the great barber moment. But that's the same sort of thing. You never see the interview, but it's all about setting up the interview, this dynamic between the three of us. You can see the dynamic between my mother and her mother, me being on the outside, not understanding any of it, having really difficult time with the camera. And same thing with the final moment, you know, it's about being seen. You know, my mother wants to be seen in this very specific way. I want her to be seen in a different way. My grandmother is sort of on the outside trying to bring the two of us together. It's a scene about censorship, about what can and cannot be seen in the film.
Yeah. That line, I guess it's not a line because it's actually something you said, where you were like, you do what you want with your face, I'm going to do what I want with my camera. I was like, oh, that's like...
I mean, I'm a real jerk in that scene, you know?
It really encapsulates, though, I think, the dynamic between a subject and a documentary filmmaker.
And between families, you know, that you're always sort of vying for who gets to be the one who tells the stories and whose interpretation is right, you know? And I think so much about the parent-child relationship is about love and protection versus independence and autonomy. And that's really coming through, you know, in that scene as well, where I'm asking my mom to take off this mask that I see her wearing. And she's saying, you know, you don't understand what I went through. Just respect the mask as I wear it, you know? And that's really an allegory for the whole film, you know?
And it's in contrast to the scene with the grandmother where she's like looking at herself in the mirror and she's pointing out all her wrinkles and she's like, oh, the wrinkles under my eyes, my forehead. She's like, she doesn't care. She's like, yeah, whatever. It's great. Wrinkles are awesome.
You know, it's funny. You know, in the edit room, we would sometimes call my mother like the sleeper main character because the film... You really think it's about my grandmother and between me and my grandmother trying to understand her stories. But really the heart of the story, I think is really about between me and my mom. That push and pull between protection and love, autonomy and independence. It's, who gets to claim what stories as theirs. I think that's all really between me and my mom. And there's a little bit of it between my mom and her mom, my grandmother.
Yeah.
Well, it's also on the idea of like the power of storytelling is a theme there, because the power of storytelling could be a double-edged sword. It could be the thing that's going to give you clarity through a family lineage you don't know about. But from another perspective, the power of telling those stories could have negative ramifications. And a mother trying to protect their daughter from hearing stories that has harmed them, it might cause trauma, might cause fear, anxiety, might cause external threats is something that's a valid thing for a mother to be worried about. So this idea of like the double-edged sword of a powerful story is a really interesting thing that is sort of carrying this thing a lot of the way.
And what diaspora Iranian hasn't heard? Call yourself Persian, not Iranian,
Yeah. I've even heard tell people you're Italian.
Tell your people you're Italian. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's this really great quote. The first generation survives and the second generation are the storytellers. And I think that's like a really big thing in diaspora cultures. It takes a few generations to be able to speak openly, to have the privilege to speak openly.
Why did you decide to rekindle this relationship with your grandma when you did?
Yeah, this film came out in a really specific period of my life. I had been living in New York City for about 5 years. I had been working in the film industry for about that long. I was in my, mid to late 20s. And I was around a lot of other Iranian American people for the first time in my life. Growing up in Vermont, shocker to probably no one, there's not a huge Iranian community here. And so the people that I was around who were Iranian growing up were my family and maybe some like family friends that my mom had met in the area, but no peers, really no peers. And so when I was living in New York and I was working in film and I had, recently graduated from art school, I was meeting other Iranian Americans who were peers for the first time. I started to be really frustrated by the fact that I couldn't speak the language. And, if you don't speak the language of your family, I think it's really common for you to hear I'm curious what you guys would say, but, at family functions or, Iranian gatherings, you would always have people I would always have people come up to me and say, greet themselves in Farsi and start talking to me. And I have to kind of do this awkward dance of like, oh yeah, no, I understand. I'm Sierra. I actually don't really speak that fluently, but so nice to meet you. You kind of have to do this little awkward jig and people are like, oh, that's so nice. And then they go away and they never talk to you again.
Yeah.
Or I was in a place in my life where I wanted to learn the language. I was having experiences of having Iranian American peers for the first time. I was getting really disillusioned by the fiction space that I was working in. And was getting more curious about documentary. And I was also trying to make my own work again for the first time. After graduating art school, I had been working on sets and working on other people's projects. And I got a residency in Banff, actually, in Canada.
Oh, cool.
And I was working on some of my own art projects for the first time since I graduated school and just kind of getting back into creative headspace. And at that residency is where my mom called me because my grandmother was trying to open up to her in a new way for the first time.
Oh, wow.
And that phone call is in the beginning of the film. I'm walking across this Arctic snowy tundra. You can hear my mom's audio over it saying, oh, your grandmother is telling these stories about when she was young. So she called me and really beckoned me home when I was at this place in my life where it was just the right time, where I wanted to make something of my own again. I wanted to get closer to my family's history. I wanted to learn to speak the language. It all sort of like came together at the right moment.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And your grandmother, you said, did see a cut of the film?
She didn't, actually. The last year of her life, she was slipping into dementia, and so she wasn't able to really have a hold on reality, and washing stuff was very difficult for her. Before she took a downward turn, she saw some scenes that ended up not making it in the film, but one of the scenes, she was telling this really cute story about lying to her mother as a young girl in order to buy a short skirt that her mother wouldn't approve of. And she really loved to be seen and she loved to be recorded. And she was very tickled to see a scene of the film that involved her face being like very large and front and center. And so I really wish she could have seen the final thing. I'm so curious what she would have thought about it.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, she passed before she was able to.
I think she would have been proud because if nothing else, you paint her in a portrait that's so endearing. I mean, I fell in love with your grandmother watching that doc. She was so sweet, funny, charming. Very much reminded me of my own grandmother. And I think you did her a great service because if she's someone who loved being seen and loved, the camera on her, then you've introduced the world to someone as loving and caring as your grandmother. So you've done a great job.
Thank you.
And her legacy will live on through the film. And I think it's also fair to say that you have definitely inherited her prowess for storytelling.
That's a huge compliment. Thank you.
Oh, well, when she would tell those stories, she would paint such beautiful scenes. And I think the way that you were able to complement her stories with the visuals shows that, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So
Well, thank you.
she, I'm sure, would be very proud.
Yeah, thank you so much. She's definitely was larger than life and is now, larger than life and death. And, I guess I'll leave you with this little story. She was very aware of being recorded and loved being recorded when we were filming. And often I would leave the camera running and just go off and do something else in order to not have my presence affect what was going on in the scene, just sort of give some space when I'm not around. The camera was always set up, always in the space, just to make people comfortable with its presence. And so sometimes I just set it up and then went and did something for, 10 minutes and came back and got it. And there's this really great piece of footage, not in the film, but she starts talking to the camera directly. And she was 88, 87 when we were filming a lot of it. And so she knew she didn't have a ton of time left on this earth. And she gave this incredible 15-minute long speech to each and every member of the family and what she appreciated about them.
Wow.
And talked about what would happen when she would pass and, what she wanted people to remember. And I found it, after she had passed away. And it didn't have a place in the film, but she passed away a few months after we locked the rough cut of the film. And I pulled out that piece of footage and we played it at her funeral. And it was really special because she was speaking directly to everyone in the room by name.
That's beautiful.
So she had a real awareness of what it meant to be recorded and what it meant to leave a legacy behind. And I think she was always making decisions with that in mind while I was filming.
That's amazing.
There's a question from Jasmin.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Cool. We have a caller.
Yeah,
All right.
imagine.
Jasmine's on the line.
Actually, Sierra, do you mind opening your door?
Yeah.
She's waiting outside. Yeah. But her question was essentially, how do you feel being the subject in your own film? Are you ever worried that you being on camera may not be genuine, or subconsciously you might be influencing things, or you're putting on a little bit of a face? How do you trust yourself to be an authentic subject in your own film?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with how I chose to film. There was no crew. It was just me and a camera and a tripod and some sound equipment. And I left the camera on all the time. And if it wasn't on, it was set up, both to make my family comfortable with the filming process, but also to make myself comfortable with the filming process. If I could just flick the camera on and try and forget about it myself, it would help me be more authentic in the shot as well. And the second thing I'd say is that when you're filming with family, you really quickly become a child again. There's something that it's some sort of magic that happens when you're around family where you just, fully regress into your childhood self. And so it didn't take much, for me to forget that I was a filmmaker and turn into a daughter, especially in heated moments.
Yeah.
So I'd say that's a big part of it.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes,
This has been really
you.
enlightening and really informative.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
fun.
Thank you for having me on. It's been great. I love talking about the filmmaking behind it. So it's been a real treat for me.
Awesome.
Let us know when you're in Toronto. Kava and I will take you out to Kebab.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good.
100%.
I might have to escape this awful country that I live in soon. So maybe I'll come to Toronto.
Why, did anything happen recently?
No, yeah, nothing. nothing in particular.
Good.
So yeah.
Good. And finally, before we go, an extra treat for you all. We want to introduce our final special guest for this episode. Arian Moayed is an accomplished Iranian-American actor, writer, and director, best known for his Tony-nominated performance in Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo, his role as Torvald opposite Jessica Chastain in the Broadway revival of A Doll's House, one of my all-time favorite plays. He's also known for the Netflix series Inventing Anna, and of course, his role as Stewie Hosseini in HBO's Succession.
Also as Agent Cleary in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Arian co-founded Waterwell, a theater, education, and film company which focuses on socially conscious productions. His current and upcoming projects include the thriller horror film House of Spoils on Amazon Prime, the dark comedy horror film Shell, which recently premiered at TIFF, and the upcoming Guy Ritchie film Fountain of Youth. Arian is an executive producer of both Sierra Urich's Joonam and Jasmin Mozaffari's new short film Motherland, and we are honored to get to briefly chat with him.
Arian Moayed, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us. We really love the film so much, especially how Sierra was able to share with audiences the ramifications of exile and what it means to be an Iranian in the diaspora. I was just wondering, what was it specifically that drew you to Joonam, and why do you think audiences should see this film?
There is so much of the movie Joonam, directed brilliantly by the documentary filmmaker Sierra Urich, that I love and adore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give two moments that really stick out to me. One is towards the end of the movie, there's a scene in an airport where the grandmother and grandfather are coming home. And we see a young little Sierra with video cameras all around, and people, you could see all the family members that are in the States waiting for them to come or passing the camera around.
Yeah.
And when they arrive, the embraces that you see at the airport are so moving and so deep. It's so relatable, not only just for Iranians like myself that have just lost touch with so many of our family members that live in Iran, but with everyone. The sense of belonging, the sense of coming together, the sense of finding each other after all these years in a new land. That's something that we can all relate to. I love that aspect of the movie. There's another portion of the movie that's just so hilarious to me and shows you how important it is that comedy is brought into the stories of Iranians and the other, because oftentimes all of our stories are about trauma and victimhood.
Yes, yeah.
But there's a moment that's really, really funny, and that's at the end of the movie where the mother and daughter are having a huge fight. Sierra's having a huge fight with her mom.
Yes.
And in the other room, the grandmother is like screaming, "Are you guys fighting about me? Did I do something wrong?" And there's something so deeply personal and honest about that, but also so hilarious that it makes even the two of them laugh. So I adore Joonam, and I'm glad that more audiences will get to see it in 2025.
Arian John, thank you so much.
I love this movie, and I'm glad that you guys enjoyed it as well.
The movie was so great, and it was honestly an honor to have you on the show. We'll definitely have you back on again soon. Once again, you can watch Arian in his most recent films Shell and House of Spoils, both available on Prime Video, as well as Guy Ritchie's next film, upcoming soon, Fountain of Youth.
And that is it for Cinema Rex. Again, Jasmin, once again, thank you.
Thank you.
Farhan, thank you for being such a wonderfully passionate host of the show.
Thank you, Kaveh.
You know how I feel about you.
Unfortunately.
To all of our listeners, thank you for listening. The Omid Didar.
Bye. Also, like, subscribe, comment, share, all the things.
Are you saying bye every time you say it, or are you saying Baha'i?
Music for Cinema Rex was written and performed by Sohail Sadinejad.